Hello and welcome to Culture in Between, a podcast all about exploring the unique experiences of people who grew up in a culture outside of their parents' culture. We're your hosts, Alyssa and Brianna, and in today's episode, we have Becca, who grew up in the Philippines with American missionary parents. Welcome to the show, Becca. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I'm so excited. It's going to be fun.
Thank you. Yes, we are very excited to talk to you because this is definitely different from pretty much all of the guests that we have planned for the podcast, at least for this season. So can we start by having you tell us where exactly in the U.S. your parents are from and then where you all lived in the Philippines?
Okay, well, my dad, he was born in a tiny town in Tennessee. Like, his parents owned a farm. His dad wasn't a good farmer, but he worked at like a local factory, and he's the only one who went to college in his family, and he had a passion for missions. So he got a master's in theology, and then he became a pastor in Montana and met my mom. It's just really random. My mom was a speech therapist. She grew up all over. My grandpa was a pastor, but she grew up mostly in like the West Coast, like Seattle area. And then I grew up in the Philippines in the northern island of Luzon. We moved a lot. My parents were like Mr. and Mrs. Flexible of the missionaries. So they just kind of went where they were told, but we were always in that one area, which is like the northern, it's a big island.
And can you tell us a little bit about like the missionary, like what maybe organization they were with, or like, yeah, what was their purpose going to the Philippines?
They were with the Southern Baptists. They have very strong belief that that Jesus is a savior, and they wanted to share Jesus with others. And they weren't there to change culture. They were there to just teach Bible. That was their goal.
Yeah. Just like assimilate with them and
Yeah, we were we weren't expected. My parents had the goal of like living like the people as much as possible and just sharing Jesus with them that way.
That's awesome.
Well, that's really fascinating. So can you tell us how many years did you live in the Philippines?
So I was born there, and when I was 19, I went to college. So I lived there pretty much that whole time, except when we'd come to the States for what we called stateside assignment. So a total of 16 out of 19 years of my formative years, I lived in the Philippines.
And did you go to school with other Filipino kids, or did you go to international schools? What was your school experience like?
So I had a very mixed experience. I went to like in preschool, I went to like a little local church, and then we would come back to the States for like a year here and there. So like first grade, 6th grade, half of 10th grade, I went to public school in the States. And then my parents did put me in a private like school in the Philippines, but it was terrible. It just did not work. I was like a freak. I don't know how else to word it. Like, they had not seen white people ever. And literally the kids would touch me and would not like listen to the teacher. And like, I couldn't move. It was like it was just horrible. So then my mom started homeschooling us. Plus, when they teach English, like whatever the grammar rules are for their language, they teach it, they use it for English. So it's not the right grammar.
Yeah.
So it's just not, it didn't work. So my mom ended up homeschooling us. And then in high school, I went to a boarding school which was an international school.
You kind of been a lot of different experiences. It sounds like you have siblings. Can you maybe list like how many siblings you have, and were they also born in the Philippines, or were some born in the States?
So my brother was born in Texas. He was a year old when he went to the Philippines, and my sister was also born in the Philippines, and I'm in the middle. So there's 3 of us.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And so that was really interesting that you talked about how you kind of felt like a freak in school, because that was going to be like my next question is just how were you, and I guess your family as well, received in the Philippines? Like, I mean, were people used to seeing American missionaries, or was it still kind of a novelty? Like, how were you treated, I guess, as people who obviously weren't Filipino, but entrenched in the culture like that?
We were definitely interesting. And also the Philippines, it was during World War II when the Japanese took over, the United States went back and freed them basically. And so they have a deep respect for Americans. Like, Americans are considered like good to them. Like, they freed us. They were a colony. So, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
But like they just love Americans in general. They think we have a lot of money. So then poor people are like, hey, give us money all the time, which we want to help people, but you can only do what you have the ability to do, of course. So that makes it difficult.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you came back to the U.S. here and there during your time in the Philippines. So can you tell us what that experience was like coming back to the U.S. after living in the Philippines for a time, and kind of going back and forth like that? When you were in the U.S., did you have like reverse culture shock? Were you having to get used to the culture here? What was that like?
Oh, it was definitely like a culture shock. Like I remember walking to Walmart and being like, holy cow, this is like the biggest store I've ever seen. Like we had a market, an open market with like fish swimming, like essentially from the local like beach. Like that's what I grew up with. And it was a lot. It was very awkward because people expect you because I spoke English like my parents, so I had an American accent and I look like an American because I am American, but inside I don't feel like culturally, like they're just little things that I do that are not American, but it's hard to explain because I don't realize I'm doing it because they're subconscious. My grandma was like German and she was very like strict. So mom would have us like for 6 months before we weren't allowed to like eat with our hands. We had to use like silverware. It sounds like silly stuff, but like she would make us like train us because otherwise my grandma would be like, what are you what are you teaching your kids over there? But normally when parents are chill, they're like, yeah, let's do it like the people. It's all good,
Yeah. Yeah. So your relatives, they live in the States, so they probably getting accustomed to you, like, having things that you picked up in the Philippines. So that's really interesting. You told us where you lived, but like, can you tell us a little bit about, did you move around within the Philippines or?
We did move around. We always lived not in the city. We always lived what we call in the barangay, like in the very like rural areas. We didn't have like a phone line till like 1996. There was no phone line going through the town. Like when my parents went to the Philippines in, say, 1984, I believe is when they went. They decided to move into a house in a Filipino, like they just rented a room in a house and they had to learn how to cook on a wood stove. It was like learn by fire, literally, because there was no telephone. There was no way to contact anyone. My mom said it was the hardest thing she ever did, but they were the only missionaries brave enough to do it in our mission. So that's how my parents raised us. So we had a nice house compared to the locals, but we had a very basic furniture and like we just kind of assimilated that way.
That's awesome. That's such a unique experience. Like, I feel like that's so cool that they really wanted to engulf themselves and their children in the culture. Did you end up picking up the language Tagalog, right? Is that how?
Yes.
Okay.
I spoke it. I still speak it fluently. I'm a little
awesome.
rusty. I haven't spoken a lot, but once I get like 30 minutes into a conversation, I'm good to go. When I was little, we lived in a different place, and I spoke another language called Ilocano. So I was like trilingual, but when we moved to another place, I lost it because kids gain and lose things easily. And that also like put me behind, I guess, with schooling because I couldn't, when we came to the States in first grade, my English wasn't that good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's funny.
That's crazy.
So do they have multiple like different dialects and stuff
They
throughout?
have like over 1,000.
Wow, really? I did not know that. Because Tagalog is the only one I'm familiar with. I have a best friend who's Filipino, so I know of that one, but I guess that's probably the main
That is
language.
the national language, yep.
Okay, but then there's little pockets. Okay,
Yeah.
I was not aware of that.
And variations of each language. There's all kinds of stuff. I don't even know all of them for sure.
So Tagalog was almost probably maybe the first language you learned. I don't know. I guess you spoke it probably as good as you did English, or maybe even.
I think it just happened simultaneously.
Yeah.
Like my parents spoke to us in English, but then everybody else spoke to us in Tagalog. When I was born, I think they spoke Ilocano there. But yeah, it was just all simultaneous at the same time.
Okay, can you tell us, like, kind of walk us through your elementary school experience, middle school experience, high school experience? I know you were like homeschooled for part of that, but can you kind of tell us what it was like growing up there as of school age, like in your school experience, and how it differs from like a typical American school experience?
Well, our curriculum came from the States. So as far as like academics, I feel like I probably had a very similar experience to a lot of homeschooled kids in the US because they use the same curriculum. I was actually a really good kid, not to brag, but mom would wake me up at like 7. She would give me like my assignments and I would just do them. And then when I got done, I would go and play with the local kids that I would play with. My brother and sister were another story, but but that's how I did homeschooling. And then public schools in the U.S. is just like it would be here. High school was a little rough. It was like a really ghetto school. It was a shock to the system. There was like a daycare for the students in the school. Like I was like, I don't know where I've come from.
Okay.
To come from a very conservative, like rural area.
Okay.
It was a little shocking.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, okay, so you grew up kind of in a more rural, like most of the places, even though you traveled around quite a bit, you grew up mostly in rural areas. And did your siblings assimilate as much as you did, you think? Or or I don't know, I guess maybe you can't speak for them, but how did you observe?
Oh,
that?
we were all the same, I feel like.
Okay.
We all have different personalities in how we deal with things. My sister has a learning disability, so I feel like her language skills weren't as good as mine. That's about it.
Cool.
Yeah. So how was it coming back to the U.S. in a more permanent fashion after living in the Philippines, growing up in the Philippines? Was there ever any talk of maybe staying in the Philippines or moving elsewhere? How did you decide to move back to the U.S. and to stay here permanently? And just what was that like?
I think it was always the expectation. I was born in the Philippines, but in the Philippines, the law is that if your parents are American, you're automatically American. So I didn't have the citizenship to work in the Philippines legally. So I guess my thought was always that that's how we were raised. There's not really options there. But when I did come to the U.S., it was a big adjustment because I did feel inside very different than people around me. And like, I remember kids would be talking and telling their stories, and my stories would always start with in the Philippines. And because I literally have nowhere else to talk about, and I'm a talker, so I had to join in the conversation. And after a while, people got annoyed with me because they felt like I was trying to show off that I was different.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't trying to show off. That's just literally all I had to go by.
Yeah.
But one experience that I had that really made a big difference defining in my life is when I was in high school. I went to the States in 6th grade, and it was really hard. I was bullied a lot. I was just very different. My parents didn't really dress me cool. I didn't really know it was cool. Like, it was just bad. And then in 10th, and then we left. And I finally, at the end of that year, I made friends, and then we left again.
Yeah.
So then in 10th grade, we were only going to be in the States for 6 months. And so I vowed not to make a single friend because I didn't want to deal with the hurt of, moving again and losing that friend. So during that year, I was kind of depressed because I'm an extrovert. Did not work out for me. And so when I went back to the Philippines, I went to my boarding school, and there I had lots of friends. So I remember in college, I vowed that I would never let myself do that again. And I kind of vowed that, like, if someone invites me, I'm going to go, because you just don't know unless you experience it, which sounds really dangerous. I may have not made all the best decisions in college, but I felt like unless you go and put yourself out there when you're alone, you're not going to make friends. You're not going to make the best of the situation. If nothing else, learn from those people and that experience that you had. So I'm very passionate about doing that and living fully that way.
That makes sense. That could be, I can see how that'd be difficult. And like, I mean, even I'm sure just like culturally, there are probably things that like music and things, I don't know how, how much you were keeping up with that kind of stuff.
It's not.
Yeah, that, things that would have maybe been popular in the States, like when you come over, because I think you said you come over every 4 years or so? You come over for
it was 4, and then in between there was 3.
Varied.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Britney Spears, whoever, I'm trying to think, was popular at the time. Like I don't know if you are you listening to all the music? So like if kids are saying whatever slang or whatever is cool at the time, like you're probably not up to date on that. So that probably was hard too, right? Because I feel that now as like a person without children and trying to keep track of what the cool what the words are now. So I'm just kind of relating it to that. So
for sure, it was really hard to connect with people when you don't know. Like people are in, because you're not really interested in what people are interested in.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any like specific stories of times when like someone would make some sort of cultural reference that only like Americans would understand and you just like didn't get it?
Oh, I can't think of anything. I know it happened all the time. It's probably because I really didn't know what was going on to even remember.
It was
what
too painful. You just blocked it out.
I
was like, I don't know. This is awkward kid in the corner over here trying to make the best of the situation. I mean, there are experiences like this one girl I met in college. I'm like, oh, she seems like a nice Christian girl. I came from a conservative environment. So she's like, come to a birthday party with me. I'm like, cool. So we start driving there, and I'm like, so what are we going to do? Play board games or something? She laughed so hard. There was definitely like drugs and all kinds of stuff at this party. And I was like, I stood on the wall. Like, I was like, not what I expected expected, but I was all in. You know, I had this motto that I was going to enjoy life, whatever. And she knew I was uncomfortable, so she left within like half an hour. We didn't really hang out after that, but it's all good.
Yeah. You put yourself out there.
I sure did.
Yeah.
All the way.
Yeah.
I was not ready for it at that time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That must have been like welcome to America.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
People are funny that way.
Wow. Yeah. So I guess taking it into kind of the present, looking back on all those experiences and just, you know, how your life has been kind of divided between these two countries, do you feel like you don't fully belong in any one culture? And how do you kind of reconcile that feeling? Because that must be a little bit disorienting to kind of feel like, okay, I grew up in this place, but I never had citizenship there. And then I didn't grow up in this other place, but technically that's where like my whole family is from. And everyone, if you just hear me, you think I'm American. What is that like, I guess? Like, do you ever feel like you just don't fully belong in any one culture, and how do you kind of deal with that?
All the time. I feel that way. You know, I go back and forth. Like, I always find people that I connect with, and there's always people out there who genuinely enjoy that you're different. And there's always people out there who kind of think you're showing off again. It happens in adulthood. It happened more like, you know, in college days. But I just feel like I just find the people who are okay with who I am, and that's how I operate. But sometimes I do feel kind of lonely. Like, okay, I don't belong anywhere, and this is kind of lonely.
Yeah, because most of your formative years were in the Philippines. So it's such a, I mean, even though you've been living here for a good little while now too, like it's, yeah, you know, that's still made up a lot of who you were. And so, you know, Philippines is a third world country. What was that like? And like, how has that shaped, I don't know, your appreciation of, you know, living in America in a first world country?
Oh, it's made a huge impact. We lived very remote. People were starving. People had dirt floors. People shared a hole in the ground to use the bathroom. You know, these were our neighbors. This is what I saw growing up. And it's hard because you come here and you're like, people are just kind of more superficial, but it's easy to judge people too. You know, that's also like, you have to understand where they're coming from. So I feel like in the beginning of college, I was kind of like, it was hard because I don't know, there'd be like a party and everyone would be like, I need to buy a new dress. And I'm like, y'all need to buy new dresses all the time? Like, I don't get it. Like people are starving in other countries, but like after a while you realize that it's okay also to enjoy the things that you have to a certain extent, but also just know what's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For sure.
It probably gives you a better appreciation because I know like when Brianna and I go visit Jamaica and see where my parents grew up and everything, it's always a bit of a shock and to like, I always come back to the States being like, wow, like I really appreciate kind of what I grew up in. And I find that like when I'm over there, I don't really need a lot of the things I think I need. Like, so yeah, I'm sure that really has probably helped you be able to just appreciate more in life and not get so bogged down with maybe the consumerism of America and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
I think it definitely makes me more content with the material things that I have.
Yeah.
For sure.
And that kind of leads me into my next question, because having parents from a third world country in Jamaica, our parents often would tell us like, oh, you don't need this and you don't need that and don't waste this and don't waste that, which of course is good. But I'm wondering if you do that to your kids now. Like if you...
I was thinking that when you were saying that, I was like, oh, snap.
Yes. How has your upbringing impacted her? How you raise your children.
How has growing up in the Philippines affected how you are raising your kids now here in the U.S.?
Oh, definitely. So this is just a random story, but right before Halloween, I took Rosalind to Disney on Ice, and I let her buy, like, they had Encanto theme, so I let her get a costume for that, and Halloween was, like, the next month, and my husband's from India. He's born and raised in India, so he also grew up in I guess it's technically second world, but a poor country, and so she wanted a tiger costume, and she'd been talking about this tiger costume, but both of us just kind of were like, no, we already bought you something, like, you use what you got. And she was so sad, but she kind of was like okay with it. So she made up her own costume. And then one of the kids made fun of her for it on Halloween, which kind of made me feel bad. But it's kind of, I also want her to learn to be okay with what she has. So it's a struggle because I want her to be able to choose things that she likes. And we just live in such an affluent community. Like, I live in the suburbs and it's very affluent.
But are there any other ways that you've kind of passed down some of the Filipino culture that you were raised in to your kids, like in a different way, like maybe just in terms of like foods or just interests, that kind of thing?
I think for me, just I have a passion for being content with material things and just knowing what's important. So that's something I really want to instill in my kids. I don't know if I'm quite there, but we're working on it with my 4 and 6-year-old. So I still got a little time.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I do cook Filipino food. My husband's Indian. I cook Indian food. So I'm sure that hopefully they have a varied palate growing up. And I'm sure there's a lot of subtle things that I do, but when I get around Filipinos, they'll tell me things that I do that I don't realize I'm doing that are very Filipino.
Wow.
Unless you're Filipino, you wouldn't realize that. Like,
Yeah.
making sure your kids eat. That's like a very they better eat. I'm sure your parents did that to you growing up.
Yeah.
It's very important to you.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yes.
That's funny.
My husband does similar stuff too. Like, don't waste your food. People are starving.
Yep.
Like, you're so privileged and you don't like the food.
Yeah.
If you aren't going to eat this, then too bad. Like, that's kind of like,
Yeah.
getting another option.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I think that there's a certain universality amongst like immigrant parents with that, with the food and not wasting it. Like, it's a big, which I fully understand. Like, I get it. But yeah, I think that's like pretty widespread amongst, no matter where your parents come from. Like, yeah.
What do you miss the most from living in the Philippines?
Filipinos, they're really great at just loving you for who you are. Like, they're the most accepting culture. Like, if you go to a potluck, there'll be all these mixed kids. Like, they just love everybody. Everybody's welcome. When they move to a country, they just find the good in that culture. And that's one thing my mom always taught me is like every culture has good and things that maybe aren't so good. So take the good and run with it. And the stuff that's not so good in your own culture, like let it go and take on the stuff with the other culture. You don't have to be stuck in one thing.
Yeah.
Do what's good in both the cultures.
And have you been back to the Philippines since you moved to the U.S.?
So when I first went to college when I was 19, my parents were still living in the Philippines. They lived there that would have been 2005 until 2014. So what is that? 9 years later, they retired. But when I first went, my dad came for like 2 months with me. I got my driver's license. 2 days later, I drove him to the airport in Atlanta. It was like the scariest thing I think I've ever done.
Driving in Atlanta's a scary thing.
That was fun. That was fun. Then I moved myself in my dorm like 2 days later.
Wow.
So dad just kind of left me. Mom says that to this day. He was the craziest, scaredest person in the world. Like he was so scared leaving me because it's a lot to leave your little girl like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now I want to kind of transition into talking more about the culture as a whole, Filipino culture. So I think a good place to start is always with food. What is your favorite Filipino dishes? And after that, I want to ask you about a specific food that I've heard about, but we'll start there. What are some of your favorite Filipino dishes?
Chicken adobo, which is like a soy sauce and vinegar based sauce. I love eggplant. They make this omelet with eggplant. You like grill it and then you make you fry it with an egg. It's so good. And you dip it in fish sauce. They also have like this calabasas, basically their pumpkin. I think they sell it here like that in certain international stores, but I just like all the veggies and stuff. All the fish fresh from the beach. Oh my word. There's nothing like a fisherman caught this morning.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've heard about the infamous balut.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Yes.
balut. Yeah.
Can you tell our listeners maybe what that is, and do you like that, or I don't know, I've heard.
It's funny because Filipinos, they eat every part of the chicken and everything except for the bone, but pretty much every part. But balut is basically an egg with a chicken in it, a baby chicken, and they boil it and they eat it, and they consider it really good for for your brain, to be really good for your brain, basically. And you have to eat it in the evening. So these guys will come around, these vendors, and they just hold on their back like these boiled eggs of chicken, and they scream balut, balut everywhere they go. And as a kid, I ate it.
Ooh,
I love that stuff.
wow.
But now as an adult, it's so funny because I came to the States and I was like, I can't eat that stuff anymore.
Oh my gosh.
You tell people what it is,
Yeah,
they're like,
people
what?
just look at you.
Yeah. I'm like, even I think that. I'm like, but I used to eat this stuff.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
I remember eating chicken intestines. It was like
Wow.
grilled and it was my favorite. I used to beg my dad for this stuff and now I'm like, I'm good. I'll pass. Like I know better now.
You become Americanized in that way.
Oh my
now.
gosh. Well, how did that happen? I don't know.
Yeah.
I could eat it. I'm sure I could swallow it some way, somehow. I don't know.
Yeah. Another like food related thing I've heard a lot about from the Philippines is Jollibee. Like people say that it's like better than fast food here in the US. Do you have like an opinion on Jollibee? What do you think of it?
So the thing is, we lived really remote. There was no Jollibee where we lived.
That makes sense.
So when I was in, but we used to go to like these mission conferences twice a year, and we would drive to the city, and it was a big deal because you'd finally have McDonald's and all this other stuff. But they had everything there, and Jollibee was. We used to do American stuff because we just didn't have it at all because we ate Filipino food. So I didn't really eat it a lot growing up. Honestly, it just wasn't available.
Gotcha.
And when it wasn't the first choice for my parents, and that's fine. I understand.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So then kind of like a bit of a negative question and then a positive question. So first, is there anything that you kind of disliked about Filipino culture at all?
Ooh, I don't know if I could answer that.
or living in the Philippines in general. That's a tricky one. I'm on the fence about that question for guests sometimes.
Right.
No, that's fine.
No, it's tricky because honestly, I loved it there.
Yeah.
Like of course there's things you don't like, but I can't think of anything, that I experienced really, truly negatively. I think it was awkward being like this white kid. Because where we lived, like there were missionaries, but usually it was like young guys. Like there wasn't families with kids. That was like bizarre. Or there would be like American men who married Filipinas and would go and visit with their mixed kids, but there was never like blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids running around the village. That was really odd.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then on the positive side, what do you love the most about Filipino culture?
They're very people-oriented. And so I feel like, so I'm by profession an RN too. And one thing that I found through working with people who are in the dying process is at the end of the life, you realize what's important. It's really people. And I feel like Americans miss that. They worry about their career and other things and like they become lonely. But the most beautiful thing is seeing someone who's surrounded by their loved ones at the end of their life. It's just the saddest when they're not. And I feel like Filipinos, they're just so people oriented. There's always people around. They value that. They take time with that. And they just make it a priority. Makes them late to stuff, but but they got their friends. So, they're living life fully. And I feel like that's something that we're just blessed to do in life. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Yeah.
It is. Did you find that people were actually more content and happy over there, even though their, surroundings are, not very great, like than like what you've seen over here? Yeah.
100%. It's amazing how someone in a village, they all live, and there were people always that were mean to other people to their advantage. There's always people in every culture. And then you hear stories, but in general, people just kind of work together to help each other. I remember if we ever had no electricity, which happened quite a lot, everyone would go to like one house and have a candle. And we, as kids, would play with a candle. Like we were completely and utterly having the time of our life, putting our finger over a candle. Like, don't tell my mom I did that. No, just kidding. But it was just crazy how like the things that we enjoy are just different. And like, you just stop and like literally smell the roses is what you do. And that's something that we miss sometimes here when we live in this affluent. We have to plan everything. There's no like
fast paced.
Show up. Yeah.
Work hustle culture.
Yep.
Kind of thing. Yeah. 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 I've heard similar sentiments from other people who have traveled to kind of locate like their real countries like that. And it seems something that holds true because you think like, well, how would they be so happy with having less? But sometimes, when you have more, you realize you don't need it.
So another thing that we like to do on the podcast is kind of dispel stereotypes or just talk about stereotypes. And
Stereotype Mythbusters is kind of what
Ooh, that's kind of fun.
We're not tied to that name yet, but we'll see.
I like it.
We'll see. But I just think it's always interesting, to kind of talk about stereotypes. I tried to do some research and I don't necessarily have a lot of stereotypes about the Philippines per se. But one, and this kind of goes back to you mentioning that you were an RN. One in particular that I've seen in my
where this is going. It's true. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, one in particular that we've actually experienced in our own life, because like Alyssa said, one of her best friends
is a nurse,
a Filipino nurse, and we know other Filipino nurses. So that is a huge stereotype about Filipinos, is that they all become nurses. They move to the U.S. and become nurses, like just go to nursing school. Yeah. So what is your take on that? Is it true? Can you give some rationale behind it if you might happen to know? And does that have anything to do with you having become an RN as well?
I don't know if it really has to do with why I became. I remember seeing a lot of kids like in the Philippines who were like had open, just, if you get a little cut, if you wash it and you put Neosporin on, it's good. But if you live in a third world country where you don't wash it or use dirty water, it becomes big. And if they don't have money to pay for it, then the kids are just literally hanging around crying because they have big open wounds with flies in it. This sounds really gross, but like this is the reality that happens. I remember seeing that growing up. So I had a passion that like this stuff is easy to fix. This isn't hard. I mean, I was like in 6th grade, I came to the States for a year and I like collected like $100 from my church, and I went back and bought bandages, and I was like, I bandaged all the kids that had little boo-boos because those boo-boos can turn into something if you don't take care of it. So that was like my mantra. So that's how I started. I just want to be nurse. I read everything about Florence Nightingale, like Mother Teresa, like they were my people. But with the Philippines, with the nursing thing, so the Philippines was there's actually a history behind that. So the Philippines was actually a U.S. colony. Before World War II, they purchased the Philippines from Spain. Right. So they used to help like countries get freed from the colonists. But in this case, they actually went behind the back. It was not a beautiful part of history, and they purchased it. But anyway, and they built an infrastructure, but they have like a deep-seated relationship with the Philippines. So they speak English really well. Most Filipinos, I mean, they still have like their accent and stuff, but they speak English better than most other countries and stuff. And so there's been like, I think since then, they've always recruited nurses. There's always been a need. And Filipino culture is very like service-oriented. They're really good in like, they're just very patient. They're very kind. Their culture is just kind of accepting. They're there to help each other. That's how their culture is. So they're just really good at it. But yeah, some of the recruiting is not so beautiful in reality. Some of the articles and you hear stories, but honestly, when you live in a starving place, you're just happy to get a job. It's not that bad.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, being a nurse is an important job, and in the U.S., a pretty lucrative job for the most part. So yeah,
and it tracks well with what you've been kind of like echoing throughout the interview, is that Filipinos are really caring and people oriented and looking out for one another. So that aligns very well then with that type of career.
So no Mythbusters here.
Okay,
today.
so that one's true. That one's true. Okay, I expected that one to be true.
Honestly, like that was the main one that I had. Really, like I don't know if you have any more, Alyssa.
I'm trying to think. What is okay? So like I said, my husband went over to the Philippines and he is about 6'2", and he said he was towering over people. What is like the average height over? Do you think?
I have no idea, but my dad is like 5'8", and he was definitely a giant over there.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not very tall for the most part. Okay. There's always those token people, that are taller, probably mixed, like maybe when the Spanish were there or whatever, who knows what.
Yeah.
I mean, can you think of any stereotypes or misunderstandings that maybe you've heard over time about the Philippines that you wish people would understand is like not true?
That's a hard question. I have to think about it.
It's okay.
I feel like there's something in my brain, but I don't.
That's okay.
I don't know.
I think in general, like Americans, if they know about the Philippines, they have a pretty positive view of the Philippines. Like I don't know. I feel like it's types for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure what people know about the Philippines. Actually, I mean, Brianna and I have not an outlier experience, but we grew up in Miami, Florida, so a lot of different cultures and things. So I don't know if I wasn't exposed to like a best friend who was Filipino, and I had lots of other friends in school who were Filipino, so I kind of learned about the culture that way. But like I don't know, like kind of what America's overall viewpoint of
Filipinos, kind of like wherever they go, they just become.
Yeah,
they're not like the type of culture that goes and it like becomes a little village of their own. So I think that's why, like, when they come to the States, you don't really hear of like a stereotype besides the nurses thing, which is true.
Yeah.
But they just kind of join in everywhere they go. They almost like to copy. That sounds kind of negative, but they are their own people in that way. But it's really beautiful how they do it.
They're not looking to like shake things up. They're just trying to like blend in and kind of assimilate. Yeah,
I got just trying to like have a little fun here and there, get a job, feed themselves, like nothing major.
Gotcha. Hardworking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's true. I feel like like they do just kind of like assimilate and really well into any culture. Yeah. I mean, I think those are all of our questions here. Do you have any more questions, Alyssa?
I think I'm good. You gonna make fun of me about saying that again? I did a good job this time.
No, you did a very good job. No, you did a very good job. I think that's about it. Thank you so much, Becca, for joining us. It was so amazing to hear your experience, a very unique experience. And you did a great job of really like telling us about all the things you did growing up, things that I never would imagine growing up in a village in the Philippines. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We'd like to thank Becca for taking the time to share her story. It was fascinating to hear about her experience of growing up in the Philippines as a daughter of American missionary parents. We would like to thank you, listeners, for tuning in for another interview. Your support means the world to us. And if you like what you hear, we would greatly appreciate it if you helped us spread the word even further by leaving us a rating on your podcast player of choice. Thank you again, and see you next time.